That's it. Okay, I will tell you, in all disclosure, this is about a 2.5-hour presentation, and I took a very small part of it, so I won't talk that fast. But this is the application part, and so that's really what I want to get into the hands of teachers. We actually did an in-service for a public school, and I will tell you the reaction was a little bit mixed when it came to servant leadership. They looked at me and said, "Why do we want to do that?" And I went, "Oh, that kind of hurt." Because, I mean, that was just a public school attitude. I went and did the same presentation at Baylor, and they were all excited. I'm like, "Oh, yay, they actually believe in this stuff." So I'm hoping y'all will lean toward the Baylor side. If you know anything about servant leadership, it has its roots really in the teachings of Jesus Christ. He was a servant before he was anything else. From that point, there was a Robert Greenleaf, if you've heard that name, did a lot of research on servant leadership. And then from that time on, I worked with Jim Law, which is another really major contributor to the field. I actually got to meet him doing my dissertation, which was an incredible thing. We talked about this. And what we're going to find is a study that was done off some of Law's work. And that's what we're really going to focus on with the idea of servant leadership. So this is not as much of a background as it is applying these principles to the classroom. Okay? There were two researchers, Wong and Page, that actually looked at servant leadership, and they combined what they thought, after doing several surveys, servant leadership was into these areas that you see on the board. And this is really where we're going to have our focus today. If you look at them, you're going to see something different. Humility, serving others, courageous leadership, and visionary leadership has to do with you and your character and what you believe. Okay? If you look at 5, 6, and 7, empowering and developing others, this open participatory leadership, and then inspiring leadership has to do with kind of an outward expression of what you believe, and it really goes along with your relationship and how you interact with other people and other things. I found something very interesting in looking at this. They found two opposing forces to leadership, and they said that this was basically the death of servant leadership. Anybody want to take a guess at what those might be? If you look at this, what would you kind of consider the opposite of some of this?
Pride.
Egotistical pride was one. Very good. We should have like gifts to throw out, right? Get an extra hand out. Second one was authoritarian hierarchy. In other words, we are so bound by the rules that we forget to look beyond the rules to see how they apply to people. Which I thought was really interesting. They said if those two things are present, then you're going to have a very difficult time with the idea of servant leadership. So let's get started. Hopefully we'll have some fun with this. Principle number 1 is humility. Basically, it is absence of ego, absence of pride. If you think about it, would you consider the teaching profession one that exhibits humility or being humble? Just for the most part. One of the things I've always heard is you don't go into teaching for the money. You know, you go into teaching because of the impact on students and other things. So I think just by virtue of the teaching profession, you kind of have humility that's there. So it's really thinking of yourself less than thinking of others. How many of you guys have heard of John Maxwell? John Maxwell has some great books. You can actually have too much Maxwell, in my personal opinion, but he has some very good ideas from some of his books. I mean, I had a boss one time that loved John Maxwell, and that's all we read, and it became the Bible. Not such a good thing, but he has some very good nuggets. One of the things that he says in his book, Winning with People, is who we are determines how we see others. That's an interesting thought, isn't it? Because if you had one of those days, I mean, it seems like it's not as much Mondays, but maybe Fridays. Think about next Friday at the end of the week after all the meetings and everything else, and you're just exhausted, and a student comes in and wants to talk or to process stuff. How many of you can say, "Come on in"? How many of you can say, "Come on in," but the back of your mind you're saying, "Oh," right? Who you are determines how you see others. Okay? So let's break that down just a little bit. Who you are determines what you see. Have you ever had a really bad day coming to work, and you come into your classroom and you look at one of your students and you just go, and you have that negative thought where they might not have done anything at all, but that's your perception? Okay? True. What you see, how you see them, how you view life, and then therefore how you act. And this is one of those things we discuss frequently in our house with the whole idea of the physical, and emotional versus the spiritual side, because if you look in Scripture, it tells us we're supposed to, guard our hearts, guard our minds, watch our words, and so forth. The physical side, have you ever just wanted to kind of slap somebody mentally in your mind? And you don't really do that, but it's almost as if those two things are warring inside of you, and you're sitting there just smiling at that person, but you're thinking all these other thoughts. This is all part of your lens, okay? Now, all of this comes down to this statement. I believe that humankind is basically fill in the blank. And if you look at your handout, there are actually some kind of guiding questions, and to me, this was, again, part of Maxwell's research. Are you generally optimistic or pessimistic? People tend to fall in one category or the other. Which childhood experiences have molded me into what I am today? Most of the time when you talk to people, they can think of very positive or very negative childhood experiences, and that tends to color what they do today. Maybe they had an encounter with a dog when they were very young, and that translates to, I'm not going to deal with dogs the rest of my life. Does the same thing happen in the classroom? I think it could very easily. Who will I be in 5 years? I ask that to my students, and most of them give me that blank look because we don't tend to think that far in the future. But we need to. And then what are some personal qualities I need to cultivate? All that relates to the idea that says I believe humankind is basically what? When we did this in the public school system, the overwhelming majority of responses was very negative. Going downhill, they cheat, they do anything they can to get ahead. They're Wayne, what was that? They're a generation of give-me's, I think is what it was. And it's not surprising knowing that these teachers in the classroom, whether or not they realize it, are portraying that to their students. Because that's what they teach them. So something that we need to be on guard against. Okay, principle number 2, serving others. And serving others, for some, if you have the spiritual gift of service, is a really easy thing to do. For others, it's much more difficult, okay? But really, when we're talking about serving others, we're talking about looking at others' needs ahead of your own, which can be very difficult. One of the quotes I found as far as servant leadership says that servant leadership, as far as teachers are, go beyond the classroom and into life. We're going to talk about investing in the lives of students. It's really easy to do within the confines of the classroom, but how many times do students follow you to your office, and then they stay there during lunch, and they do this, and you're thinking, I'm not going to get to eat again today, right? But you have to make a determination. How do you serve others? Okay, so again, something that's absolutely critical. Greenleaf, in part of his later publications, wrote a very interesting book called The Teacher's Servant. It's actually about a professor at a university who chose to take an unpaid job as a dormitory director, is what they called it in those days. And he did the janitorial work, and he looked after the kids and did all kinds of other things. And he said he learned what service was really about at that point, because by sharing lives with those students, he learned who they really were. And that says a lot. I mean, if you're Cornerstone's mentors, it's the best job and I think the hardest job at the same time, because you really invest in the lives of the kids, but that's how you make that eternal impact. Okay? So, how do you do that? You value others, and then you practice patience and tolerance. Fun words that we have. How do you value others? First question is, do you invest in your students? How many of you would say you invest in your students? Just everybody raise your hand. We're supposed to invest in our students, right? Okay? That's one question. They did some surveys in college classrooms. They asked the students, do you believe that the teachers invested in you? Do you think the responses were the same? No, because we say, hey, we're teaching, we're sharing all our knowledge with you. That's investing, right? The students didn't know that the teacher cared about them, and so they said, my teacher really could care less. And so there was a huge difference when they looked at that. So the question isn't really what we believe, it's what our students believe, because that's the only really barometer of whether or not you're valued. Okay? Now, the fun one, practicing patience and tolerance. Does your classroom provide this balance of freedom and structure? We have, for so long, had the sage on the stage, the talking head that comes up, right? How many of you are comfortable with that? I mean, if you're going to be honest with yourself, going up and talking, for a lot of people, that's a very comfortable thing, because I have complete control of my classroom. Because since you guys don't have input, I can teach, and it's okay. But what happens when you start giving students input? And when you're talking about human trafficking, and what if they have a different view, Paul? And all of a sudden you're going, ooh, how do I deal with that? If you're really going to have this patience and tolerance, you have to exhibit it in the classroom. I don't know about you guys, but some days I have a lot of patience, and then I start moving around and it drops, a whole lot, and you get to work and you're thinking, not much left. And then I go in a classroom with freshmen. Ooh, they challenge that. They really do. But open communication, a spirit of optimism, and then this idea of a culture. I've been in classes and the teacher said, oh yes, I have an interactive classroom, we talk, we communicate, we do other things, and the students are sitting there going, and that's all they do. And as the students, they said, oh no, because if we talk, the teacher tells us we're wrong, or they correct our points, or they minimize what we say. I've had that happen to me as a student. You think, hey, this is a pretty good point, and then the teacher goes, well, not really. What do you have to say? And then you're thinking, great, I'm not saying anything for the rest of the semester, right? It's hard. I'd much rather have full control, but what I've learned is that when I let that control go, as long as I've kind of put some parameters in place, it's the best thing. Now, here's a question. You are the architect of your classroom. Do you think about what you want your classrooms to look like and feel like at the beginning of the semester? I mean, one of the biggest things I found is I meet my students at the door. That requires that I get there early. And in the morning, sometimes that's a very difficult thing to do. But I meet them at the door, I say, hey, how's your morning? They laugh at my coffee cup. Some of them steal my keys, other things. But they know that from the very beginning, I'm there, I'm here for them, I'm ready, and so forth. So what kind of architect are you? One of the things on your handout, and this is for you to do later, has a personal mission statement, and I want to challenge you to do that for yourself and for your class. Okay, a couple questions. What is your purpose, and why do you do what you do? Because that translates over to the classroom. Some of them, I teach for the money. Like, I'm not sure because you wouldn't be teaching at LETU. But, I teach for the money, and if that's communicated to your student, what happens to everything else we've talked about? It's gone. Yeah. Why do you do what you do? So I challenge you to do that. We're not going to have time in here, but that's your homework. Courageous leadership. Love John Wayne. It's being scared to death, but saddling up anyway. Do you have fears as a teacher? Okay. Is what I'm doing really worth my time? Are my students getting these concepts? For certification-based courses, are they getting all the information they need? Do you feel overwhelmed sometimes when you go to class thinking, I'm never going to get this across? You have to figure out how to work through that. So, let's talk about courageous leadership for just a minute. It's based on this idea of integrity and authenticity. I've had teachers in my past who knew everything and told me that they knew everything. And if they didn't, they would probably make up things on the spot. Have you ever experienced that? And later you think, not even close to being true. I've also had teachers that said, I really have no idea, but let me get back to you. What kind of teacher do you want to be? If I say I know everything, I'm lying to myself. I know that because I don't. But if I get up there, we talk about things like discrimination. And we talk about gender discrimination, which is really fun when you have, a pretty mixed group in class. And how do you address that? How do you really talk about that and be open and honest? It has to do with the culture of the classroom, but you have to be willing to actually tackle this. It comes down to we teach who we are. Okay? If you're afraid to tackle this in class, have you shied off of the subject sometimes? And then students look and go, oh, we didn't cover that, wonder why. It's working through that. Okay? So, creating that in the classroom where this can happen. You have to have clear boundaries. If somebody crosses the line, sometimes it's easier for me as a teacher just to let it go. And sometimes if you let one comment go, it's probably okay. But if that starts a trend where there's a freedom, where there may be some, and I wouldn't call it abuse, but maybe some comments that are kind of offhanded and other stuff, you have to be able to set those boundaries and stick with them, period. You have to be consistent. And as a teacher, that's so hard. Anybody have favorite students? Nobody raised their hands. Okay, you all have favorite students, right? Just admit to it. Do they know that they're your favorite? Yeah. Okay, we have one honest person in the entire class. They know you're their favorite. You have to be consistent in your actions, and sometimes that's hard. Because even if it's, your absolute favorite students, you have to be aware of what's going on. You have to do the right thing even when nobody else is around. And that's tough. I mean, as a teacher, if I have that student that's right on the borderline, and I really like that student, and I have another one that has driven me crazy all semester, I want to bend the rules. But I'm accountable to God for that. And students will find out because they talk. Okay? Visionary leadership. Love Tom Landry, grew up with the Cowboys. Getting somebody to do what they don't want to do to achieve what they really want to achieve. That's pushing. Okay? Sometimes for your students, you need to envision the future for them. First day of class, my speech is, guess where my expectations are? Right here. And my students can tell you that. And I start outlining what I want them to achieve, and some of them are just going, oh my gosh. But if I didn't do that, I used to do some contracts with my classes. I had students that were happy making a C. So what is the minimum I have to do? Okay, I'm good with that. I don't know that I'm good with that. So I want to push them, and it's my job. This is part of that architecture, right? I'm creating a classroom for success. So that's something that you have to do. So how do you do that? High standards. And hold to them, please. Makes the rest of us have an easier job, This is the rules, period. Teaching them what they need, what they want, not what they want. I love it. Students come in and say, well, I'm paying your salary, and I'd really like a day off today, right? Have you heard that before? No? Okay, just wait. It'll come back. Because, their tuition pays your salary, and they really need that time off. It'll come, I'm sure. Relate information to their lives. That's something that's there. And then let's cross our fingers and hope this works. I pulled them up, so I love it when it's this way. Really good sound. This is off of Facing Giants.
So, Coach, how strong is Westview this year?
A lot stronger than we are.
You already written Friday night down as a loss, bro?
Well, not if I know we could beat them.
Come here, Brock. You too, Jeremy.
What, am I in trouble now?
Not yet. I want to see you do the death crawl again, except I want to see your absolute best.
Okay.
What, you want me to go to the 30?
Finish state.
I think you go to 50.
50.
There we go.
I can go to the 50 if nobody's on my back.
I think you can do it with Jeremy on your back. But even if you can, I want you to promise me you're going to do your best.
All right.
Your best.
Okay.
You going to give me your best?
I'm going to give you my best.
All right, one more thing. I want you to do it blindfolded.
Why?
Because I want you giving up at a certain point when you can go further. Get down. Jeremy, get on his back. Good tight hold, Jeremy. All right, let's go, Brock. You can use off the ground, just your hands and feet. There you go. A little bit left, a little bit left. There you go. Jeremy, good effort. That way, Brock. Keep coming. Very best. Your very best. Your very best. Keep moving, Brock. That's it. That's it. That's it. Keep going. Don't quit on me. Keep going.
How far did he think he could go?
He wasn't sure of 50.
He wasn't sure, but he started talking about 20 and 30, right? Guess how far he goes?
100.
To the end zone. Okay? I wish I had time. It's a great clip. We'll come back maybe if there's time at the end. But it's really such a great thing that we do as teachers. Can you push your students further than they want to go? I think we can. And it's one of those, I mean, we're not doing it for selfish motives, but because sometimes we see the potential of things. So that's something that's there. Empowering and developing others. Treat people really how they need to be treated and not necessarily where they are now. Because especially if you teach freshman classes, some of them really have no idea who they are, what they're doing, or anything else. If I treated them according to who they saw themselves as, my standards probably wouldn't be very high, but I see something more. Okay? So you need to develop and empower others. Maxwell calls this the enlarging process. You have to learn to see the potential in others, cast that vision for their future, because sometimes they can't do it for themselves. Find out what they're passionate about, help them with their character flaws, but then focus on their strengths. And I love it because it's kind of like gardening to some extent. you're growing these students. So again, something that we need to think about because students may not be able to do this for themselves. Who believed in you? Can you think of somebody in your past that believed in you when you didn't believe in yourself? It's either a yes or no kind of thing. Okay? Nobody here would probably know who this guy was. But he was a band director when I was in high school. Moved from large metropolitan area to a small town. Never been in a band. But by the time I graduated 2.5 years later, I could play 5 different instruments. Okay? And that's something that he did. I didn't think I could do it. So if you were asking me who believed in me, his name's Jim Jones. Still around, lives in Carthage. But it's one of those, be that teacher. Be that teacher. Okay? Open participatory leadership. You've got to be willing to share what's going on. That means listening to other people. How hard is it to listen to your students sometimes? I'm going on to the next thing, right? But it's listening and it's also watching what they're doing non-verbally. So that's absolutely huge. And then inspiring leadership. Push them to be really something beyond what they can be. That comes down to not necessarily what you do, but who you are. Are you invested in them? Do you love them? Do you serve them? Do you do lots of different things? Okay? That's just a real short 1-minute clip. If I can get to it. Probably one of my.
No matter what anybody tells you, words and ideas can change the world. We don't read and write poetry because it's cute. We read and write poetry because we are members of the human race, and the human race is filled with passion. Oh, Captain, my Captain. From home by Walt Whitman. On this class, you either call me Mr. Keating, slightly more daring, or Captain, my Captain.
Teaching them to see the world from a different point of view. If you've not seen Dead Poet Society, I would highly recommend it. It's about a teacher who takes a basically ragtag group of boys and invests in them and creates something bigger than what they are. Inspiring leadership, it really comes down to character, okay? And I want to leave you with this quote by Greenland. It says, "Could not many respected teachers speak those few words that might change the course of the life or give it new purpose?" You realize that we as teachers are in a very unique position to change our students' lives and be a part of their journey. So challenge you to do that. Real quickly, there's a handout with the 7 points of leadership that we talked about. And there's lots of different applications. Lots of different applications. Matt Stevens does a lot of good work in this area. But anyway, tackle one a month. See how far you get by the end of the school year. Okay?
We have maybe a minute, 2 minutes for questions and answers. Any questions? All right, I'll ask one real quick.
Okay.
Have you at all heard about Kent Wilson's work in steward leadership as opposed to servant leadership?
I'm not. What road is stuff?
I'll send you his dissertation.
I was going to say, well, we can ask what the difference is, but that would be later than being able to do that. So, anything else? I have tons of stuff on servant leadership and other things.
One of the differences between your Baylor students and your public school students, the public school teachers have very rigid, detailed, authoritative rules they have to stick under.
Right.
So,
And that was actually mentioned in our thing, but it has to do, and at least in my opinion, it has to do with still investing when you are within the confines of those classrooms. Because you can tell some students were, or some teachers were really interested in how they could do that, and others just said, no, I'll just teach and leave. But I guess it's learning to operate, not breaking those rules, but operating within those confines of the work.
We found that those teachers that were receptive to servant leadership also had a base of faith that the others did not have. And so
We found that out after the presentation.
yeah, that was very interesting to see.